Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, a podcast that aims to provide valuable information to young saxophonists and music students in a digestible amount of time. I'm Owen Robinson, and today I will be interviewing Dr. Michael Torres, professor of saxophone at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Torres, thank you for being on the show. It's great to have you.
No, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you, Owen. Yeah.
So I've read that you have an interest in visual art such as black and white photography and acrylic painting. Do you feel that these areas of interest influence the way you think about music?
I do. I think, as a composer, as an interpreter of music, and as a composer, performer, composer, and as an educator, I tend to think that my experience with all of the arts sort of inform themselves, and I would say that, as an artist, I gravitate towards the term artist as well, sometimes instead of even musician or composer or performer. And I think that the arts they inform each other, but for me personally, I think all of it comes from the same place. It all comes from sort of the same creative energy, if that makes sense, as an artist. The way I approach, interpreting, comes from that same place that I compose from, or comes from that same place that my aesthetic, interests are in for painting and photography, and I think it's just the way I hear things and see the world, and I think that manifests itself artistically from the same energy. I would say more specifically, when I started painting, and I would consider myself an amateur, and I'll talk about that in a second. But when I started painting, I started realizing how the brush stroke connected to the air, right, on the saxophone, and how consistency with our air, transferred directly to sound and control of sound and timbre and color and all those sorts of things, and the brush stroke, how you can manipulate it, and it changes the visual, and how you can manipulate the air, and how consistency plays a part in that process as well. I think that they do sort of connect, and particularly, as I was saying before, when I started painting, there was that sort of epiphany realization that, wow, this is really making me think about how I use my air as a saxophonist, and also the other side of that, and I'll go back to the point I was making before about being an amateur. I really do truly embrace that. I consider myself an amateur painter and photographer, and I do other things like, I write poetry, and I collect sound recordings and all those sorts of things. And I embrace that idea of amateurism because I think that there's value in that. We sometimes, I think culturally we think of that word as a sort of a negative. There's this weird idea in the United States about both the negative, the negativity of the word amateurism, but also the negativity of the idea of specialization, right? We're afraid of specialists in the United States, and which is silly, but also we're afraid to be amateurs at things as well. And I think that amateurism, I think, means that you don't have to be an expert at something to gain joy from it, right? And also to learn from it, and also to for that thing that you're getting joy from and learning from to impact your life in profound and even small ways. So I think even chamber music to a certain extent throughout history, you could make an argument that it was geared towards amateurs, right? Making music at home with your family for fun, for joy, to learn, to grow, right? And so I think, being willing to try new things and explore and experiment and allow those new things to, maybe perhaps grow, but also to just impact your life. And for me, they impact me artistically, right? They make me think about how I am creating art. So for instance, when I'm painting something, and I'm dealing in the realm of the visual, right? Or when I'm taking pictures, and doing black and white editing, I'm thinking in terms of the visual, obviously. But when I'm making music, I actually am also thinking in terms of the visual, like the narrative, the story, even if it's not programmatic music necessarily, but maybe it's telling, the music might have a narrative of some sort. So I'm imagining things, right? And making those connections between what I imagine and what I want sonically to come through. And so that visual element, the storytelling, definitely has an impact on the interpretation, and the storytelling, the narrative of my music making, if that makes sense. I think also, from the perspective of the amateur, which I think is, this part is really kind of fun. You have to learn something from sort of the basic elements, and you have to practice a skill, and you have to practice a skill sort of at a fundamental basic level, and then reproduce that and improve that skill. And it's sort of fun, right? And we get to a point in saxophone playing, because as saxophonists, I would say that there's lots of ways of being a saxophonist. There's not just one, right? That's an important note to make. But one of the ways we do saxophone culturally is this, in the classical saxophone realm, the concert saxophone realm, is reproducing, right? Recreating. If you look at the other art forms, not all, but a lot of the other art forms are primarily creative, meaning they're making something new. The whole idea is to create something new. Not always, but I would say that's an important part of being an artist in many of the other art forms. Granted, a painter is still going to study, the things of the past, and they're going to even use those as teaching, tools, recreating, replicating, learning from the techniques of the painters, the great painters that came before, right? But they're not going to do that. I mean, most of that work is to study, right? Their goal is to make something from their own voice, from their own perspective, from their own unique worldview. And in classical music, we recreate the voice of the composer, right? So we're recreators to a great extent. Now, of course, there's an art to interpretation, and that's important, right? And having our musical voice, a lot of times we use that word, musical voice, but what we really mean is sound quality, right? Or tone. So what could a musical voice be? Like, how could thinking about art from a creative perspective instead of a recreative perspective, how could that influence how we interpret music? Now, I don't mean to say that we should not be thinking about the integrity of the musical idea from the composer. Like, there's people who feel that their sole job is to be the vessel for the composer. I think that's great. I think that's wonderful, and it produces really interesting things. But at the same time, Creston is no longer with us, right? I do not share Creston's worldview. I don't share and I mean that from the perspective of, culturally, but also time as well, right? I am from a different, cultural background, as a, American of, Cuban descent. My cultural heritage is completely different from Creston's, but also from the time perspective. We're dealing with, social and, climate and political, environment that didn't exist in Creston's time. So when he was writing from a worldview that we cannot, go back to. I can only play the saxophone from my worldview, from my existence, from how I see the world, how I interpret, how I hear the world, how I listen to the world, right? And that's from a 21st century perspective with my cultural background. And so maybe there's a level of authenticity that's missing, right? So all I can do is do my best in interpreting what the composer wanted on the page. But my music making, that comes from my world experience. And that is influenced intrinsically from my art, right? And I think that we can learn something from the other art forms because they're more creative in the sense that they're tapping into what it's like to be human today, as opposed to what it was like to be human in a time that we can't go back in time to. Does that make sense? So I do think that, being an artist in other fields, whether it's at a supremely high level or it's at the beautiful amateur level where you're learning and letting that art form sort of influence you and learn from it, and it just, brings joy to you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. And I think, that is kind of an interesting predicament just in the realm of classical music in general. Just, how do you breathe life into something that is, 50, 100 years old, 150 years old, et cetera, et cetera. Like obviously the saxophone repertoire of what's originally written for saxophone is not that old, but we play music that is old. Like we'll play Baroque music, violin transcriptions, and then, every day somebody is, transcribing something new. This cello sonata, that violin sonata, et cetera, et cetera. And, I think saxophonists, as much as anyone else, have to think about, how do I engage an audience with a material that was written so long ago,
Sure, and I think there's a combination of values here. There's value pedagogically in doing transcriptions, of course, and there's artistic value, personal enjoyment value, right? You can grow from it artistically. You can learn from it artistically. You can get joy from doing transcriptions, old music. I think that's really wonderful, and I think that what I was saying before really impacts this discussion in terms of it all comes down to creativity, and what is creativity, and where creativity comes from, and how do you sort of wield creativity, and how it impacts what you're doing artistically, whether it's old music or new music. But I do think that makes a strong case also for pursuing contemporary music. And I think contemporary music is another umbrella term. Like classical music. What does classical music mean today? I'm not even sure necessarily that I would define my music as classical music necessarily. I think we fit into somewhere inside of that umbrella term. Contemporary music is a similar thing, because contemporary music basically just means like music that's being written today. New music that's current, right? And most of the time that means by living composers, but composers are of all kinds, types, and influenced by all types of music, not sort of confined by any particular style or genre at this time and point in time musically. But they're alive, and you could talk to them, and you can get their impressions, and you can understand what influences they have. Whether it's I'm talking musical influences, but also beyond that, like cultural influences, right? Economic influences, geographic influences, political influence. There's all sorts of ways in which the music that they're making is sort of driven by their living worldview of being a 21st century human that you can ask them about. and that can have an impact on how you make that music, right? But you can't, without study, and even with study, you're limited because you're reading someone else's words necessarily. And even if you're reading the composer's words themselves, it's not the whole picture of a composer. You're limited in what you can pick up from, sources of composers who are not living. And so to an extent, you have to use your imagination, and you have to sort of be that vessel for the composer, but you can only do that from your worldview and your perspective. And so I think the other art forms are really helpful in cultivating that worldview, cultivating how you approach interpretation.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And, my professor at Michigan State, Joe Luloff, he'll often encourage students to look at paintings. He has lots of works of art in his office. He'll use, colors as description for certain, types of sounds or colors of sound. And I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of pedagogues and performers, use color and visual analogies to describe, music. It's something that's, I think difficult, but to do for some people. I know personally, sometimes I do have trouble visualizing the specific images or pictures or colors while I'm playing, but it really is helpful to to playing, to interpretation.
Yeah, it can be, but I would even go beyond, visuals, because narrative doesn't necessarily need to rely on the visual. Music is a really interesting art form in the sense, having dabbled in a lot of other art forms. I'm not sure there's a such thing as a truly abstract form of art, but I would argue that art is sort of a concept. It's human made. It's an idea, right? We created the idea of using art to communicate, to express something. And when I say express, I don't necessarily mean restricted to emotion. I mean expressing anything, ideas, concepts, questions, facts, fiction, emotions, certainly, but metaphor, metaphysical ideas, just about everything. And I think music does that. Music can do that really well, and I think music, what can make interpretation and music difficult and challenging is the fact that it can be more abstract than some of the other art forms. Like, for instance, I do poetry and I paint, right? So if I'm painting and I use the color red in my painting, if you see the color red, I think that's going to have contextual information that's going to give the human brain the ability to use our own history and our own experience and our own, engagement with that color to tell us the process of interpreting what that means. Like, if I paint with red, maybe my brain says stop. Maybe my brain says blood. Maybe my brain says sunset. Maybe my brain says any of the experiences that I have with red, right? Or words, language. If I write the word, dog, my brain is immediately my imagination is funneled into my experience and the narrative of my experience with dog. So I'll think of the dogs I've had. I'll think of the dogs I've seen. I'll think of my favorite TV dogs. I'll think of, the scary stories with dogs, whatever, right? But it sort of limits my imagination because it's funneling it into the context of my experience and my history. But with music, and this is not always true, but with certainly like with music with words, right? You have that narrative that sort of contextualizes what those words mean, because words have meaning in and of themselves outside of the context of whatever it is you're experiencing. But music, without words, and even if whether it's programmatic or not programmatic, it has more of an ability to engage the imagination because it could mean anything or nothing, right? Whereas a lot of the other art forms have more explicit meaning that rely on, human engagement. Sound could just be anything, right? And not completely abstract, but slightly more abstract. For instance, if one composer says, I'm pushing this note, and on the piano, and it's A440, right? And in this piece, it represents a chicken, whatever. In the next piece, when you hear that note, most of us, maybe if you have perfect pitch and you remember, perhaps, but if you don't, like the majority of us, then you're not going to remember that it's chicken. And certainly if the composer intended that note to be chicken in that piece, but didn't tell you, would you just assume that it was chicken? I mean,
right,
maybe.
Exactly.
Right. But if it said the word chicken, absolutely, it's going to have the contextual information beyond even the word, and that's going to relate to our experience. So what I mean by challenging is that because music, not absolutely, but generally speaking, could be anything. That means that there's so much room for interpretation. There's so much available, space to be creative, to make the narrative special and genuine and authentic to you as an artist, as an interpreter. And that's why I think that, it's scary to think that there's like one way to play Creston. That's a terrible idea. If there was one way, then I'm sure someone's already played it, and has already recorded it. What's the point of playing it, right? What's
Absolutely,
the point of making
yeah.
art with it? Yeah, so.
Very true, very true. For my next question, in addition to your education and performance degrees, you also hold a master's in composition. Tell me more about your compositions and the kind of opportunities that composing provides an active performer.
Yeah, I am. I'm a composer as well, not as an amateur. I teach composition at Ohio State as well as saxophone. And I in my previous institution, Muskingum University, I taught composition for 10 years. I think that my music, my composing, I describe it generally as a juxtaposition between consonance and dissonance, and I definitely am interested in resonance and texture, right, through complex, stacking of complex rhythms, and I'm really timbrally curious, and so I would say it's also dramatic, moments of serene beauty, and then moments of just chaos, and there's drama inside of it. I would say, composing is that creative side, right? It comes from that creative side, and of my making, of my artistry, and it has been incredibly, profoundly impactful for me as a saxophonist. I teach this to my students. I really believe that when you practice compositional skills, even at the amateur level, you're starting to think like a composer. And when you start to think like a composer, then you're going to understand compositional decisions in the repertoire that you're playing. You're going to start to think like, why did Creston do this from the compositional perspective? And that's going to start to make you think about how the inner workings of the piece, functions. So when you start to think like a composer, I think it directly influences your interpretive skills as an artist, as a saxophonist. So I think there's a direct connection to that. I think, practicing composing, even at a low, at an amateur level, not at like, not with the intention of becoming a professional composer, still gets you thinking and starts opening up skill sets that help you as an artistic performer. That's the goal, right? We want to be artists. As I said that to begin with, I consider myself an artist, and we want our music making to be artistic. We don't want it to be, technical without the musicality. We don't want it to be musical without the strong sense of fundamentals, the technique. We want both of those things, and then on top of that, we want it to be informed by our worldview and connected to our souls, right? We as saxophonists, we're so obsessed with our fingers, that we forget about our heart. We really do forget about our heart when we make music, and so, but I do think that the composition side of things, it can only be beneficial. So I started as a composer writing saxophone music. That's what I do, right? I'm a saxophonist, and so I started, to think creatively with sounds that I was making, with pieces that I was playing, and I was like, wow, that's a really cool sound. And I started improvising with those sounds, and then, I started to think, about constructing them, and, thinking about form, and putting them together, and then writing music for myself to play was the very beginning of me as a composer, and then performing my own music, and that is a profound experience. That's a sort of a spiritual experience, if you will, like just making your own music and presenting it and sharing it. It's very personal, and it's terrifying. It's scary because it's you, right? You're not just playing Creston. You're not saying, well, it's not me, it's Creston. If you don't like Creston, it's not that you don't like me, right? You're presenting you, through the music, and it's exciting, it's terrifying, it's really personal, and it makes you, I think, grow artistically as a saxophonist, also as a composer. The more you compose, the better you get at composing. But when you play your own music, you not only do you have way more incentive to make it sound good, right? but you care, And it's not that you don't care about the other music you're making, but this music is your voice. It's you. You're sharing a bit of you. There's something really magical about that. And I got hooked. I did it a few times. I made my own music and got really hooked to the feeling, to the excitement, to the creativity, and also to what it was doing to my saxophone playing. I link a direct connection to my composing back to my greatest growth spurt in saxophone playing.
That's awesome. So my next question is one that I always ask, and it's from a teacher's perspective, how do you strike the balance between encouragement and criticism while helping students reach their full potential as an artist?
Yeah, this is an important one. This is sort of, teacher style, teacher, aesthetic, philosophy, those sorts of things. And I think this is a good question. I teach through the Socratic method. I ask a lot of questions. I just, talked a great deal about aesthetics, right? Effectively, like interpretation and creativity and all that stuff. And there's, multiple realms of saxophone pedagogy, right? If we can just break it down into very simple terms, there's the fundamental skills, and then there's the interpretive skills, right? The creative side. The skills, all in the fundamental skills are vast, everything from articulation to voicing to to technique, everything. And then the interpretive skills are a lot, I would say, harder to teach, right? But those are the ones I'm the most interested in. And now, in terms of the fundamental skills, there, I have a system, where I help my students step by step, from, first week of, freshman, first semester to the second week to the third week, and how they develop it. And every student is different, right? Obviously. And so you have to be flexible as an educator. And you have to, understand that students learn in different ways and express their knowledge in different ways. So you have to be very understanding and flexible, and different kids come in at different levels with different strengths that, complement each other and sometimes. So your teaching of the fundamentals, I think, needs to be, you have to have a plan. You have to have an idea of where your students are and where your students need to get. And I don't mean after 4 years. I mean after, where should this student, where they're coming in, be after semester 1 and after semester 2, and have a plan to help them grow, right? That's a little bit more straightforward. If you as a teacher have had some time learning how to diagnose problems and have put some serious thought into your own personal pedagogy, right? If you've done that and are willing to continue to grow, then you're already on step 1 for the fundamentals, right? And I'm simplifying this. I understand that. I know. But for the interpretive side, I think that's a great deal more challenging, right? To get our students to be creative, to think creatively, to be artistic, to express themselves. That is one of the more challenging things, tasks that we have as teachers. And I would say, for me, the Socratic method is the most helpful way of doing that. So in other words, I ask my students tons of questions. Number 1, I go into every lesson understanding fundamentally that I'm not trying to make clones of myself, right? And number 2, this is the other thing that I know about myself or about how I teach. I don't believe there's only one way of doing things. I think that's a dangerous way of approaching, anything, right? There's not just one way of life. There's multiple ways that we can approach interpretation. There's lots of schools of thought on articulation, on voicing, on technique, for goodness sake. So of course there's different ways of approaching interpretation. Listen to 10 versions of the Crescent Sonata. There's 10 different interpretations, right? If there was just one, like I said before, that would be really boring. We'd just be recreating and it wouldn't be us. We wouldn't have anything, that we would contribute to it. Or we certainly wouldn't be speaking through our instrument. There would be our voice would not be in there whatsoever. And I think that there's no point we just might as well have a robot playing music at that point. So how do I get my students to be creative and to think creatively? Well, I do it through a few ways. The Socratic method. I'm asking questions. They'll phrase something, and then I'll say, okay, phrase it in a different way. Show me a different way of doing this. I will challenge them to listen to multiple recordings of the same piece and say, I want you to tell me, compare and contrast the different interpretive ideas that you heard. Not just like sound quality, that's important. That's I believe, in developing sound, but that's a fundamental skill. Or an interpretive skill, however you look at it. But I'm saying, like, how do we shape a line? I also view the idea of shaping as being distinct from phrasing. Phrasing is, and these are all interchangeable words, and however people use them is fine. It doesn't matter. This is how I use them. Phrasing is identifying the phrase, right? Understanding, where the phrase begins and ends, where the high point is, right? Where's the most important note in the phrase, and then shaping is, how do I get from the beginning of the phrase to that most important note, and then go out of that. And so, what I ask my students to do, and I do this with the etudes that they do, they have to practice the art of interpretation. They have to practice being artists. So they write out their shaping. And what do I mean by shaping necessarily? It's not like just crescendos and diminuendos, right? That's I'm not trying to change the music. So I use a system of pluses and minuses. I use, like, for instance, forte plus and forte minus and forte. So I'm taking this one dynamic and giving it multiple dimensions. So there's room inside of one kind of forte. It's like the worst. Fairling is great. We use those etudes all the time. They're wonderful. But the worst part about those fairlings, in my opinion, is the dynamics, right? Or maybe the best part, because it forces the student to be creative, or it's if the teacher's not engaging with creativity, they just play at one dynamic. And so a lot of those fast etudes and the fairlings, they're like one single dynamic, right? And it's like play, and you're not trying to be artistic. You're just like trying to do the articulations and the technique and the right slurs at the right time, and that's terrible, right? We still want to be artistic when we're playing fast or slow for the slow etudes, but more times you'll see these dynamic problems in the fast etudes. So with the shaping and the plus and minus system, if there's a crescendo inside of a dynamic, say for instance from forte minus to forte, or diminuendo from forte plus to forte minus, right? It's still forte. So I'm not changing the music, but I'm shaping and figuring out how to use my air to navigate from one idea to the next, to shape into the most important moment in the piece. And so I teach my students, that this is important for every single piece of music you do, practicing the art of shaping, and that's the art of interpretation, right? And so going back to your question, how flexible am I? How much criticism? How do you balance criticism and support? If I tell my students that they have to write out their shaping, just so that they're not necessarily in their music, but in their etudes, just so that they're practicing the skill of interpretation, then I can't go and say that's terrible, right? If I truly believe, as I said before, that there's more than one way of doing things, and particularly for their etudes, if they come up with a creative way of shaping that etude, then they're practicing interpretation. They're actively practicing the art of interpreting something and doing it with their own imagination, not my way of shaping that, not my interpretation of that. I could definitely say, no, do it this way. This is the way. And that I don't think is teaching them. I would just be replicating myself. I wouldn't be teaching them to interpret on their own. Because in the end, they leave after 4 years and they're done with me, right? And my goal is to hopefully make the next generation of saxophonists that deals with me better than me, right? So I want them to think about how to interpret, and in order to do that, I have to give them space to do that. Now, do I always agree with the interpretation? Of course not, right? So I help guide them through the Socratic method by asking them the questions. Well, what do you think about this? Why did you do this? What about this note? Did you think about this note? What if you tried it this way? Try it different this way. Tell me, why you made these choices. All sorts of questions, and I think getting my students to critically think and think for themselves is the most important thing I can do.
What is the weirdest or most unique thing that you do to prepare for a performance?
Do you mean like backstage, or do you mean like in your practice?
Really anything, and it doesn't have to be necessarily weird or unique, but if there is like something that you do that, is unique to you, or you feel is probably unique to you in preparation.
Well, I don't know, if it's unique or anything or whatever, but I really believe in, as I was saying before, the creative side of the art of interpretation, and leaning on that, right? So I create narratives for every piece of music I play. I don't share them, with people. I'm not like telling the audience, oh, this is what I'm thinking about, the Creston Sonata or whatever, but I definitely, in terms of the practice and preparation, I come up with narratives, and I've been doing that my whole life. And I know that because I found band parts from high school where I wrote entire stories on top of the parts of like what that story of what the piece was. And it was like not a programmatic piece at all. And I just wrote stories, and actually a whole saxophone section, would do that. And we'd like add parts to the stories. And that sounds so, silly, but I still do that. I still create narratives for myself, and those narratives are, whatever they are, they're maybe, fiction, or maybe they're just like what I'm feeling or what I'm thinking or what this, piece or moment in this piece sort of says to me, so I definitely come up with narratives, and I tell my students to do that as well. And sometimes it's very elaborate and I love it, cause it's just another layer of creativity. When I'm backstage right before a performance, everyone's different. Some people like to be solitary, and some people like to be completely distracted, right? And I think I'm the kind of person who, because I tend to be an introvert, and so I want to be solitary, but I need to distract myself. So I don't want to talk to other people, but I need to distract myself. So sometimes I right before performances, I just improvise a little bit, really quietly, just making random sounds so that my brain is just calms down, so I don't know, those are weird things.
How do you stay healthy while leading the busy lifestyle of a musician?
Yeah, that is a very important point, because especially for me, I'm sure that everyone's busy, everyone's got a lot on their plate, but for me, I have like multiple hats that I'm wearing. I teach the saxophone, and I teach composition, and those are separate, studios that, I'm a part of. But on top of, just like administrative things like, committees work and things like that, I also am affiliated with 2 nonprofits in town, right? I have my own nonprofit, Columbus Audio Discovery Ensemble, which I'm the artistic director for, which is a contemporary music ensemble in town. And I'm a part of, a grant funding nonprofit in town as well, the Johnstone Fund for New Music. And so I'm constantly going between, professional, projects and tasks. And I think that, we don't talk about, mental health enough in music, in what we do. And I'm glad you're asking this question. So for me, when I can, I think there's a few things that I definitely do to help sort of ground me, but also relieve stress, because stress is a normal part of life, and it can be destructive to the creativity side of what I do. So I like to read. When I can make time for that, I like to do that. Read for personal pleasure, and exercise. I like to run or walk when I can, And then the last thing, which I think is my favorite, is spend time with my dog. Being around pets, I think, just kind of changes my mood, So yeah, I have a greyhound that I'm in love with.
Oh, no kidding. That's awesome. A greyhound's probably one of my favorite dog breeds, honestly. I have a small dog. He's a Shih Tzu, Cocker Spaniel, Yorkie mix. So like a terrier sized dog. But yeah, no, it's like so therapeutic to spend time with pets. Yeah, and I'm guessing, greyhound probably has a lot of energy, needs lots of walks.
Wrong. Yeah, that's,
really,
everyone thinks that. Yeah, so they're couch potatoes. They're retired.
Really?
Yeah, my greyhound Arwen is she's a retired racer, gold medal winner, so she doesn't want to do that. She wants to sleep. So she's a couch potato. She has like a Zoomy per day where she goes outside and just runs and tears up the backyard. But other than that, she wants to just relax and rest. Yeah, and I will say another thing that sort of relieves stress, and this is my last thing, and this is important, but making music for joy, right? We often have music that we have to play, and that doesn't mean we don't like that music, but it's also, sometimes we forget why we make music, right? And so I will not say one of the most fulfilling music that I make as a saxophonist, as a musician, is the music I make with my flute and saxophone duet with my wife, Erin, Tower Duo. Making music with your friends, making music with the people you love is, for me, the most joy-filled experience that I can have with making music. And so that tends to be stress relieving.
Awesome. Yeah, those are great comments. And I think, that's something that, musicians in the academic world, the contemporary world, the classical world run into is, it is at this point our job to perform music. So it's like there is music that you just have to play, if it's for a band, for a chamber group you're a part of, there's just music you're going to have to practice and get to a high level. But, it's important to, take the time to play things that you want to play and you enjoy. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think this was a, really, really productive discussion.
Well, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening. This concludes episode 3 of The Well-Rounded Saxophonist, featuring special guest Dr. Michael Torres, professor of saxophone at The Ohio State University. The music you heard in this episode was composed by Dorothy Chang, performed by Zachary Costello, alto saxophone, and Guillaume Ra, piano. I'm Owen Robinson, and this has been The Well-Rounded Saxophonist. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember to practice smart and stay healthy.